thinking what they might say. Have it your way, yeah. The biggest threat is something they never seen. Dial it up, patch me into the screen. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up through some bucks down. Todd told the valet pull the truck round. Push the line after we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance.
Welcome, everybody. Peace. Good evening, good afternoon, maybe good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to another edition of Luqman Nation here in Black Power Media. I am Jackie Luqman.
And I am your co-host, Baba Luqman.
And we are
the most dangerous show on social media, on the most dangerous media anywhere. Black Power Media.
That's right.
Everybody, we're all dangerous.
Whole platform dangerous.
Yep.
So we really appreciate you all joining us tonight. We are so excited about this series that we are starting. This will be a monthly discussion that we are going to have here on Black Power Media, talking about imperialism, definitely around the world later on, but we are going to begin focusing on the continent of Africa because these issues are gravely important, we believe, to our survival, right?
So what we got in the chat before we start?
Okay, so before we start, I have to look over here. We've got, let me make sure.
We got some new members.
We do have a lot of new members.
All right, well, since you have to reach, right? Oh, well, you put it over there.
Okay, let's see.
I was going to shout it out. But
okay, no, let's, you do it.
Right. All right, so let's shout out the new members, Terrence Rogers, L. Prince Capone, Gottlieb, Chanel, Natasha Eidihan, I hope I said that right, and Randall Wyatt, all new members. Hey, look, welcome to Black Power Media.
That's you know that annoying song that was sang at Red Lobster or wherever, whenever you had a
cake and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to do that to you. Big ups, welcome y'all. Thank you for joining Black Power Media.
Black Power Media family. So that means that you're dangerous too now because you're part of us. So that means you're dangerous.
That's right. That's right. So, and then in the chat we've got Yoknan DeBale. I hope that's right. David Silberg. I know that's right. What's up, David? Jared Ball. We love you too, brother. Ricky Ryan, A, Sis A, and Jadarian. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started with our discussion, if you have not shared this video, share it. If you have not subscribed to Black Power Media, subscribe right now. Like the video right now. Join Black Power Media, and you can also support Black Power Media on Patreon.
Yep.
All right. So let's start this off because we got a lot of ground to cover. And we're only talking about two countries. We're not even talking about the whole continent. We're talking about two countries that are in the midst of some serious political imperialism.
Yes.
Internal repression, but it's a result of imperialism. And to have this conversation, we are very, very pleased to welcome our comrade and brother Milton Allimadi. Milton, unmute yourself. There you go. What's going on, brother? Welcome. Oh, I think you are muted. Well, let's see. Nope.
Yeah, he is muted.
Yeah, you're muted now.
How's this?
There we go. All right.
Hang on 1 second.
Okay.
How's this?
That's beautiful.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Wonderful.
I said I love the spirit. I feel energized.
Oh, great. So this promises to be a spirited conversation. Milton Allimadi, for those of you who do not know, is the publisher of Black Star News, a publication that you really should be invested in. And he is so much more. But just to start us off, to get people familiar with who you are, and to, I guess, make people feel comfortable that you know what you're talking about. Tell folks who you are, Milton.
Absolutely. Thank you for hosting me on your show again. I am Ugandan born. At this time, I teach African history at John Jay, which is part of the City University of New York. I've been publishing Black Star for almost 30 years now. I started out in journalism when I got out of the journalism school from Columbia by working as a freelancer actually I first did an internship with the Wall Street Journal, and I then was a freelancer for the New York Times for a few years. And then I discovered a publication called The City Sun, which was a Black-owned weekly paper based in Brooklyn, New York. The City Sun really epitomized true journalism. There were no sacred cows with the City Sun. If so-called leaders in our Black communities were not delivering, the City Sun would take them to task. If European Americans were exploiting Black communities, the City Sun would go after them. It was really my definition of what a true publication should be. Completely fearless, breaking many news stories that the major corporate publications did not do. So I left the New York Times, and the publisher of the City Sun said, listen, how much do you make? I told him, and he said, I can't pay you that. I said, what can you pay me? So I can pay you a quarter of what you're making. And I said, sometimes, in wanting to be somebody who's trying to better conditions in our community, it can't be about dollars and cents. So I left and I went to the City Sun. I'm glad I did, because I think I developed really even much more so than what I learned at Columbia. I developed my skills at the City Sun. When the publisher, who was elderly at the time, had a stroke and eventually passed on, and the paper went down as well, I told myself, I'm not going back to corporate media. So I drew up a business plan. I sent it out to many folks that I knew had deep pockets in our African communities. And most of them wrote back and they said, this sounds like a good plan. We wish you good luck. But I did get a check from Camille Cosby. And that's how I started Black Star News. And I've been at it since then.
I mean, I love that story. And if you noticed, Milton said that, we're hosting him again. We talked to Milton a month ago about the upcoming elections in Uganda and the turmoil that ensued before the elections. And now that the elections have happened, there have been some other developments that we are going to jump right into. But I wanted to point out that I loved that story that Milton just told about, number one, if you're serious about doing the work of uplifting your people and improving the lives of your people, It can't always be about money.
Right.
You know, nobody wants to do all this work for free because we all have bills to pay, but no one should be in here getting, I'm not going to say that. Getting a paycheck shouldn't be the focus, the main focus of the sincere work, right?
Exactly.
And sometimes you just do have to. That's another one of the reasons it's called a struggle. And the Camille Cosby part, I think, is interesting.
It is
all by itself, but the fact that so many people in the Black bourgeois community had deep pockets, received the letter, responded, and said, "Hey, what a good idea that is," and didn't include a check in that. You know. Right. So which is the majority of the people. I appreciate exactly. Yeah. We appreciate Brother Allimadi, you telling us that story to remind us that sometimes, too often, this is what the struggle is going to be for us. That's in establishing our own thing. So there. All right. Now let's get into Uganda.
Sure.
Because the election has happened in Uganda, and give us just a little bit of background for our viewers who don't understand why we're even talking about Uganda, why it's important, and why elections in Uganda were such a big deal in this past election cycle. I think the elections were literally 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, January 14th. Okay. Many listeners may recall the name Mobutu. Mobutu was the notorious dictator who ran the Congo from 1960, essentially, officially as president in 1965, but he was really the power after he overthrew Patrice Lumumba, the hero of Congo's independence, a young Pan-African, and had him murdered in 1961. Mobutu ran the country till 1997. Mobutu was the classic neo-colonial puppet in Africa, doing the bidding of the West while making the resources of the country available to Western corporations, as well as to himself and his personal family. So that was fine. Even though the country was being destroyed, that was fine by the West. It was fine by France, fine by the United States, fine by Britain. So Museveni today in the 21st century served the role that Mobutu served from 1960 to 1997. And Museveni himself has been in power for 35 years now. Now, Mobutu was a CIA agent. Mobutu was recruited in 1959, the year before Congo won its independence. And of course, Patrice Lumumba didn't know that. He thought this was a loyal comrade. This is the same comrade who ended up executing him. The same way with Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. He was killed by his so-called best friend as well. He's number 2, Blaise Compaoré. So there's a pattern here. So anyway, Mobutu is now out of the scene. So now we have Yoweri Museveni. And what does Museveni do on behalf of Western interests? People forget that there was an invasion of Rwanda in 1990. 4 years before what we now know as the genocide in Rwanda. People forget that because corporate media don't remind us constantly about it. But had Uganda not invaded Rwanda in 1990, the genocide of 1994 never would have occurred. It never would have. And there were some attempts to try to get Uganda to withdraw its forces. At that time, France was the dominant power in Rwanda, even though it had been a Belgian colony. I mean, both French speakers, but France in the 21st century and 20th century has been much more powerful than Belgium. So it took over the role of being in control as the imperial power in Rwanda. The United States was interested in displacing that role and introducing an English, British, United States imperialism in Rwanda, and then using that as a doorway to get into Congo, which was then Zaire, because they saw that Mobutu was fading now. His health was going down. He had become a little more unreliable. It was not delivering anymore. So the West supported Uganda's invasion of Rwanda and said nothing about it. In fact, they trained the officers who led the invasion, including Paul Kagame, who's today the president of Rwanda. He was trained right here in the US at Fort Leavenworth, but he was sent as a Ugandan because he had been in the Ugandan military with Museveni. But as soon as the invasion happened, he became Rwandan, and he took over command of the RPF. And this war exacerbated the historical ethnic tension between Tutsi and Hutu. So when the plane carrying the president of Rwanda was shot down, immediately the genocidal killings occurred. And even up to date, that assassination has not been investigated by the United Nations. Why? Because it was blocked by the United States. Wow. Why? Because it would be traced all the way to Yoweri Museveni. There was a New York Times article that said the missile that shot down that plane was given to Uganda by the United States. Just imagine that. So obviously they're trying to avoid that culpability, so they've suppressed an investigation. But anyway, the genocide occurred. The French influence was displaced, and the English-American imperialism took hold in Rwanda. And then they used that as a doorstep into the jewel, which is the Congo. The Congo, as many listeners may know, per square inch, may be the richest country in the world per square inch. You name any resource, and the answer will be yes, Congo has it. Congo has it. That's how wealthy Congo is. So that, by securing Rwanda and Congo for the West, Museveni has been tolerated all these years. And then another thing he did is this. When Somalia, and I understand we're going to get into Somalia as well, collapsed into anarchy after the long-term ruler, General Siad Barre, his regime, his government collapsed in 1991. Somalia became chaotic for many years. And then about 12 years ago, the African Union sent an intervention force in Somalia. In theory, that would be good. African brothers and sisters coming to help their sisters and brothers in Somalia, a sister African country, in theory. But in practice, that operation was taken over by the United States, meaning it's not really an authentic African intervention. It's the United States in control and Ugandan soldiers acting as the intervention force, but actually serving US interests. And that's why that conflict has not yet ended. So that's why Museveni is a useful puppet for the West, for Britain, for France, and for the United States. Now, that I had to put that in broad context before I could explain the so-called election in Uganda. Because somebody listening would say, how can somebody be in power for 35 years? And obviously, he's in power because he has the army to keep it in power. Right. And the army is supported by the West. And it's so interesting. If people really want to see the template for this, they should read Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Because in the introduction of that book, Nkrumah explains, and obviously he was advocating passionately for African unity. He said, if we don't unite, these countries that wanted our resources when we were colonies will still want our resources after our so-called independence. Right. And the only way we can guard it is by uniting, having a big African army, one African United States of Africa. Otherwise, they're going to use many methods to get us to fight amongst ourselves and to remain weak. And one of the methods they will use is this. They will support another African leader to undermine other African leaders. And that African leader will no longer have to depend on his own population. He would disregard the vote because he would not need to satisfy a domestic constituency. So long as he satisfies the imperial constituency, he will be in power. And that is the situation prevailing in Uganda today. So the so-called elections are just a facade. They are meant to provide a cover, a diplomatic cover for Museveni, so the West can say, well, we had elections in Uganda, and he keeps getting elected, so that's why we keep working with him. And Bobi Wine came on board, and he upset that equation because he had so much overwhelming support of the young people. That has become apparent that it's too difficult to rig this election. Ugandans won't believe it. Neighboring countries won't believe it. African countries won't believe it. And even the Western countries now are finding it difficult to disguise it and pretend that Museveni won. And that's where things stand today in Uganda.
Brother Allimadi, it appears though that as what you were saying about the popular support that Bobi Wine was getting, there's also another side to that equation too, where there is a lot of criticism about Bobi Wine. Right. Could you elaborate on that and what that criticism consists of?
You mean from within Uganda or from outside Uganda or from Museveni or from
within? We'll start from within and then we'll go from without.
Okay, from within the establishment, the folks who are in the elite cycle, whether it's the political or the military elite, they would say he does not have experience to run a country. He's never operated a major organization. In fact, during the campaign, the government was putting up big posters saying, this is a man who used to smoke weed. How can we entrust the running of a whole country to a pothead? And those are the kind of shots they were taking against him. But this is a product of his environment. This is a young man who grew up in the so-called ghettos, and he managed to take his way to college, Makerere University, which is the major university in Uganda. And one of the other criticism against him, of course, they ridiculed him as a mere entertainer, right, a musician, because those are his skills. And that's how he built a musical empire. And then he went into making film. Now, mind you, his music, all his music and his film, they contain messages that the people really need to fight back against a corrupt system, against a dictatorship, against a government that cannot deliver medicines in hospitals. So, for example, he actually did a feature film where some of the actors play out doctors and nurses in hospitals, and ordinary people coming to the hospitals and finding there are no medicines. Why? Because the doctors who work for the government are not paid enough money, so they actually sell all the medicines on the black market. So those are the kind of films he makes. And then in his music, the lyrics speak about a government that is failing to deliver, is no longer a government for the people, so the people should take over and create a government for the people. So those are the kind of messages that really resonated, and it found a huge base. He is 38, almost 80% of the population is under the age of 35. Uganda is perhaps the second youngest country on the continent, if not in the world, after, I believe, Niger might be younger than Uganda on average. So obviously, these millions of young people flocked to his campaign.
Right.
His campaign rallies were overwhelming in size. And Museveni really realized the only way that he could even pretend to win is by launching a reign of terror. He has been presiding over a reign of terror for 35 years, but even escalated it to maximum terror in the weeks heading toward the election. There was an incident on November 18, 19, where after Bobi Wine was arrested, there was a national protest all parts of the country, and the military just started shooting at people with live bullets. And it's believed that more than 100 people were killed. The government has admitted to 54 killed. That's what the government itself has admitted. Journalists were actually shot at as well, and some were wounded and had to be treated in hospital. The police commander said he was shooting journalists for their own safety.
Oh, wow.
He said because the journalists were going into dangerous areas, and in order to discourage them from doing that, the best way to actually save them was by shooting them.
Wow.
And this
that usually works for me.
Yeah.
and this was actually widely published, including by Reuters, and carried by many publications. And then, of course, he blocked election monitors from monitoring the election, including the United States. And this is the country that feeds him and sustained him, because he knew that the margin of Bobi Wine's victory would be so overwhelming that even the United States would not be able to cover for him.
Right.
So the best way for him was to just keep everybody out of sight, and then have the election commission, which again is self-appointed by Museveni himself, to announce that he had won the election. And this itself was impossible. You know, sometimes when you think you're very smart, you outsmart yourself. And this is how he outsmarted himself. 2 days before the election, which was, and I keep calling it election by mistake, it should actually be referred to as the so-called election. 2 days before the so-called election of January 14, on January 12, he blocked the internet, total internet blackout, meaning no data could be transmitted. So then the vote is on January the 14th. And then January the 16th, the election commission announces that he had won. When the internet blackout was still on, the internet blackout was not partially lifted till almost a week later.
Wow.
So then the question was, well, you have more than 34,000 polling stations around the country. How did you get the data to add up the numbers?
Right.
So he outsmarted himself. So when Al Jazeera asked him that question, the chairman person of the election commission, his name is Simon Biabakama. He said, we have our ways of doing it.
I guess they do.
Of course they do. So
that's where things stand in Uganda.
Right. So you know, the so-called election happens. Museveni is declared the winner. Bobi Wine immediately contests the election results in court.
Right.
That case went on for a few weeks. But just recently, Milton, from what I am reading, Bobi Wine has rescinded that challenge.
Yes.
And basically has said, you know, okay, fine, I'm not going to challenge the election. Museveni is still the president. And okay, that's one issue. That's one issue of criticism. From the outset, well, I guess that would be an internal issue of criticism of Wine in the aftermath of the election. But the external criticism is this, that a few days ago, Bobi Wine apparently tweeted that he had made a call. He was on a call with Juan Guaido, the U.S. selected president. He's actually the coup president of Venezuela. He's not the president of anything. Let's be clear about who Juan Guaido is as far as Venezuela is concerned. No one voted for Juan Guaido. He was a politician who was a member of the opposition party in the Venezuelan National Assembly. He was not selected by the National Assembly to lead their party. There was a rally that the United States sponsored in Venezuela,
right,
to decry, the communist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro. And apparently, someone got a call from the State Department. This happened on the stage at this rally. Someone got a call from the State Department, Trump's State Department. Right. And they tell each other, "Hey, it's the State Department." And at some point, Juan Guaido, who is on the stage just as a member of the National Assembly, hops up, goes to the microphone, and says, "I am the president of Venezuela."
Right.
And so he positioned himself, not even really with the U.S. blessing, but I mean that the U.S. State Department just kind of went with it, in declaring himself the president of Venezuela. But he was not elected. He wasn't on the ballot in the elections in Venezuela. Not one soul voted for him. So Bobi Wine's excuse, I guess, is that he met with Guaido because he felt like he and Guaido are similar in that elections were stolen from them, which is even a problematic narrative,
right,
to frame Guaido at all. So here on the outside of Uganda, we're looking at this situation with Bobi Wine as, man, we really have to be careful that we don't frame our politics around personalities, because this Absolutely. Is a mess. So I mean, what are your thoughts on Wine rescinding his challenge to the election and this mess with his conversation with Juan Guaido, who he himself called the president of Venezuela?
Okay, very good. So I'll take the withdrawal of the petition that was before the Supreme Court in Uganda. I think that was an excellent move strategically. The members of the Supreme Court are all appointed by dictator Museveni, just like the Election Commission itself. After he filed the petition, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his name is Alphonse Owin-Dolo, was meeting with Museveni on a regular basis, claiming they were discussing state matters or what have you. This is the individual who is going to preside over the court petition filed by Bobi Wine. And then Bobi Wine filed a motion to amend his petition to introduce evidence that was finally now in his hands. And why had he not been able to get that evidence earlier? Because immediately after the so-called election on the 14th, Bobi Wine's home was surrounded by about 500 soldiers for almost 2 weeks. The military was going after all his polling station agents, his representatives who had gone to all the polling stations to sign off on the final tally at each of the polling stations. Some were killed, some are still missing, having been kidnapped. And why was the military going after them?
Right.
Because they had key evidence, including videotapes of soldiers chasing away Bobi Wine's party's, the National Unity Platform supporters from polling stations, videos of soldiers stuffing ballot boxes that are already pre-ticked for dictator Museveni. And all this evidence became available to him at some point, and he presented it to the court, and the court refused his motion to amend his petition and to introduce this evidence. So it became clear that the court's interest was not in serving justice. The court's interest was just to give General Museveni a stamp of approval,
right?
Which is what he's lacking now, because he's not been endorsed by the EU. In fact, the EU had a debate in the EU Parliament. And I bring up the EU because without the EU and the United States, he would not survive. Between the EU and the United States, he gets $2 billion every year. And from the United States, he gets military support as well. So the outside support is even much more important than any domestic base he has, because it does not really have a domestic base. So the EU made a statement condemning the violence, condemning the way the so-called election was conducted, but even more importantly, essentially dismissing the way the election commission tallied the numbers, meaning they're not willing to accept the results. The United States has taken the same position. Ironically, it was in the outgoing administration of dictator Trump, where the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa said the elections were fundamentally flawed. And so far, the Biden administration has been pushing in that direction as well. So things are not looking good at all for Museveni domestically. Now, by withdrawing that petition, he would not have the court endorsing him and saying these are legitimate elections. So let his endorsement come from the election commission that he himself self-picked. So I think, in fact, by continuing with that court process, Bobi Wine would have undermined his own claim. Because if you file a court petition, and then the court says, no, we looked at the evidence and we found that it does not have merit, how can you then say, oh, I'm going to pursue another approach?
Right.
When you already went to the court and the court said, you would almost have to compare it with the dictator we just had in this country.
Right.
Going to all these courts, right? And getting an outcome that he didn't like and continuing to condemn it. So Bobi Wine would have ended up being cast in that position. Museveni would have said, listen, he went to the highest court on the land, and the highest court threw out his petition, and now he's still complaining. So he's really up to looking for something else, not going through the legitimate process in order to become president of Uganda. I think he has much more legitimacy right now because he could always go back to the people, and he's in a position now to call for any other action that is legitimate to end dictatorship in Uganda. And the good thing about Uganda's constitution is actually states that if the constitution is usurped, which in this case it actually is, with this fraudulent election, if the constitution is usurped and any citizen who takes any action to restore the constitution, that action would not be judged as a crime.
Wow.
Yes, so that is a very powerful weapon, and I believe that is the approach that the people of Uganda should now use going forward. So now let me answer the question about Guadio, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Yeah, close enough. We don't pay too much attention to how correctly we pronounce the president's name.
Okay, my position is this: if you have the United States government, the powerful United States government, calling explicitly for regime change, meeting with this guy, recognizing him, seizing billions of dollars of Venezuela's assets around the world, all unconstitutional and illegal, by the way,
right?
Completely unlawful. So you do all of that. You publicly call for regime change in statements from the White House and the State Department. You explicitly tell the armed forces in Venezuela to overthrow Maduro. And they do not overthrow Maduro. It means something is going on, right?
Right.
It means he must have a base. It means Venezuelans may remember how Chavez was supposedly overthrown. But the army realized that there was a much more powerful force in the country which was the people.
Right.
The army humbly had to hide their tails between their legs and restore Chavez to his office. That is the dynamics that is ongoing on in that country. So in terms of Guaido, his legitimacy, I mean, I think anybody can call themselves president. I'm sure Trump still calls himself president.
Yeah, inauguration today.
Today was supposed to be the second inauguration for Trump.
So that is my response. Let him call himself president if he wants. He's not a president. But here's the bigger story, because this goes to the question that you're actually posing. The bigger issue here is that Ugandans want liberation. Mm-hmm. They want to remove this Western-backed puppet, this tyrant who's spilled the blood of so many Ugandans, who spilled the blood of so many people in Rwanda with his invasion of Rwanda in 1990, spilled the bloods of millions of Congolese, because without the multiple invasions of Congo from Uganda, all those wars would not have occurred, would not still be occurring in the Congo today, who spilled the blood of South Sudanese by invading South Sudan in 2013, December. This is the most reckless African who is on the African continent today and who is responsible for so much bloodshed. Ugandans want him removed. Bobi Wine is in a position right now to have Museveni removed. He's overwhelmingly popular. Museveni would have eliminated him physically by now, a long time ago, because Museveni controls the army and the police forces, but he knows that if he eliminates him physically, that would be the automatic end of him and his family and his associates as well. It would spark an immediate uprising. Nothing would be stoppable. The army would not be able to stop it. And they would come and eliminate him physically as well. So he knows that part. Now, I say all this to suggest that how will the new post-Museveni Uganda look? That is a question that is still wide open. But I would hope that we would have a Uganda that has progressive politics, grounded in Pan-African politics, grounded in anti-reactionary forces. And certainly you can tell that I obviously consider a person like Guaido to be a reactionary, So I think I'm answering the question two ways. Bobi Wine is the best individual to get rid of Museveni right now. He's quite simply the most popular, and he appeals to the people that matter the most, and that is the youth of Uganda. The Uganda that will be created after Museveni is gone that remains unclear. But I certainly have a vision that I would hope that Uganda takes and embraces Pan-Africanism and the message and the lessons of Kwame Nkrumah, because quite honestly, a lot of these conflicts, whether it's Uganda, whether it's Mali, whether it's Somalia, are rooted in the fact that these remain small, balkanized, weak countries at the periphery of the global economy. And the only way to end that is by bringing all these countries together. And I'll just add one more point, and then I'll wait for your questions.
Okay.
A reactionary racist like Richard Nixon even realized that. I was reading some of the Nixon, the transcriptions of the Nixon tapes. And there was one conversation where he had with Henry Kissinger in 1972 or 73. And they're talking about Idi Amin.
Right.
At that time, Amin had expelled the Asian population in Uganda. And the British also had about 70,000 British subjects in Uganda at that time. And they were afraid that Amin would go after them. And they were reaching out to the US to help them. And Nixon and Kissinger discussed, possible evacuation. And Nixon spoke about getting NATO involved, maybe NATO involved in a rescue mission and all that. And then they were calling, really racist, like Idi Amin is a ape. And Nixon is saying he's an uneducated ape. And Nixon, and then Nixon told Kissinger, he said, wait, but that's not a bad thing, because look at that educated, highly educated a-hole who got his education in the United States. Look how awful he was. And he was referring to Kwame Nkrumah, of course, who went to Lincoln University in the US. But then he said something which caught my attention. He said, you know what these African nations need? They need confederations. They need to come together. We can't have 42 African countries, And he said this because he said he was tired because when you send an ambassador to the United States, they have to present their credentials to the president. And he said, every time he turns around, there's another African ambassador coming to present credentials to him. And he thinks, so he was looking at it from a very selfish perspective, that unity would lessen the number of ambassadors coming for him to meet with him. But in the long run, he actually saw the advantages of a united Africa. So if such a reactionary racist like Richard Nixon could see it, which is of course what Nkrumah was advocating, we need to have that as the solution for Africa's multiplicity of problems.
Now, Brother Allimadi, that's a good point that you mentioned. There has been some geopolitical strategists who are even suggesting right now that East Africa is moving towards that direction, with Ethiopia and what's going on, and what's happening up and down the Nile. What is your opinion on that? Because I've seen a couple of geopolitical strategists who were mentioning that at least on the East African side of the continent, there seems to be a move towards that direction. Yes,
and in fact, East Africa would have attained it by now were it not for General Museveni in Uganda. You see, and that also is part of the issue, really. We know the bottom line is that the West, the United States, really don't want to see a united states of Africa.
Right.
Because it would present a challenge to global capitalism. Even if they happen not to take a different route, if they remain even as capitalists, they don't say, okay, maybe we need to revisit African socialism. Let's say they remain as capitalists. That would be their worst nightmare, because now there would be a dominant power like China. And the United States is always railing against China. Why? Because China can compete with the United States on the global economic market as well as militarily. So now you have another powerful entity coming on board, a United States of Africa, now competing with both the West and with China on the economic terrain as well as militarily. That just will not happen. So that is also one of the main reasons why they would support a person like Museveni, a person like Mobutu. Because so long as they maintain themselves in power, there's no way they're going to be able to form a federation or to unite with other African countries. So for example, in East Africa, Tanzania has presidential term limits. So no matter how heavily people may criticize President Magufuli for the last election, which was marred by violence and irregularities as well, although nothing close to Uganda's, of course, people know that in 5 years' time, Magufuli is not going to be president.
Right.
Kenya has presidential term limits. Uhuru Kenyatta is serving his second and last term as president. It is only in Uganda where Museveni forced the parliament to remove presidential term limits from Uganda's constitution. Kenya and Tanzania are not interested in any serious talk about unity so long as Uganda does not have presidential term limits and so long as Museveni is still running the show in Uganda. But I like the fact that younger generation of Africans, the African youth, they are not really burdened by a lot of the baggage of their parents and great grandparents. They now see the benefit in African unity. The Bobi Wine generation, Julius Malema's generation. That's why Julius Malema is one of the most popular leaders on the African continent right now. And eventually he's going to become president of South Africa. And he's, of course, the president of the Economic Freedom Fighters political party in South Africa. And Julius Malema, in many of his speeches, he's talking about the need for a borderless Africa. Let's remove all those boundaries that were created by the colonial powers. They drew those boundaries, separating sisters and brothers from their communities, one living on one other side of the border, one on the other side of the border. In Uganda, we have people whose sisters and brothers are on the other side in Kenya, and the rest are in Uganda. We had in Uganda a situation where Museveni at one point had a minister whose brother, his half-brother, grew up on the other side of the border, and he became a minister in Kenya as well. See? So all these lines are meaningless, really.
Okay, so Brother Allimadi, I think people understand the need for unity in Africa, and especially it's the younger generation who are pushing for that, who want to change, and they need to see that change coming from Uganda, and that change needs to happen through getting rid of Museveni. But here's the problem people have with Bobi Wine right now, because he has had a conversation and met with Juan Guaido as if he were an ally to him. He put their relationship or their situations on equal footing. Like we just talked about the election in Uganda actually definitely being stolen from Bobi Wine.
Right.
And there is evidence of that, concrete evidence of that. Right. In Venezuela, no such thing happened. No one voted for Juan Guaido at all. So, and when we consider that Juan Guaido represents the imperialist aspirations of the United States in Venezuela, that Juan Guaido is the tool that the United States hopes to use. I mean, the Trump administration didn't really want him, but they were stuck with him because really they couldn't find anybody else in Venezuela who probably wanted the job. Guaido was voted out of the National Assembly in the next round of elections after, in those elections in Venezuela. The State Department is stuck with him, so they're still hanging their hopes on overturning not just the valid election in Venezuela, where 6 million people voted for Nicolas Maduro, but they're hoping that Juan Guaido also destroys the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela and every country that has benefited from that revolution, including Haiti and other countries on the continent. Yep. So people are really wondering how Bobi Wine is the future of a Uganda that challenges U.S. imperialism when Bobi Wine is meeting with the tool that the U.S. hopes they're going to use to implement U.S. imperialism in Venezuela. Like, how can Bobi Wine be a radical revolutionary to unite Africa inside Uganda, but be okay with U.S. imperialism outside of Uganda and Venezuela?
No, I mean, I can't answer that question for him, but I have already made my position really clearly known in terms of Guaido. He's clearly a reactionary. I don't think Ugandans can take any lessons from him. I think Ugandans should embrace a Pan-African approach, a progressive approach, and those are the forces that can guide the youth of Africa into the future and help Africa use Africa's resources for the benefit of Africans. So I think, obviously, that may also explain the fact that he's really not had sufficient time to map out how he will rule Uganda going forward, because since he really came on the political stage in 2017, he's been literally fighting to keep himself alive in order to be around for the so-called elections of 2021 and hopefully to become president of Uganda. Was that something that, if I was asked by somebody close to him in advance, would this be something that you should do? I would have said definitely not. But I imagine that there's probably U.S. interest in terms of trying to reposition the U.S. agenda going forward in the post-Museveni Uganda as well. So imagine that might have guided that kind of meeting coming together.
And I agree with you, Brother Allimadi, that a lot of that what we're seeing right now, we shouldn't be jumping to conclusions, because there's a lot of things that we don't know what's going on. I mean, on the surface, it doesn't look right, to those that don't support Guaido. But I think that we should just take a position and see what's going on, But what I'm saying is that being over here, we take the position without knowing the intricacies of what's going on. I don't know if it's a political strategy or whatever it is. It doesn't look right. And like Brother Allimadi said, I would probably advise him not to. Right. But again, I mean, who really knows, why he met with him?
Well, I think that this is where we can have some principled internal struggle, right? Yes. Because while I do think that there is an element to, and I'm acting as if I have a crystal ball and I can see into Bobi Wine's head, and I obviously cannot. I do not know the man, and I don't know what he thinks. But I'm just thinking, kind of with the information that we have. Bobi Wine is 38. Yes. He's very young. He has been in politics in Uganda. He's been an MP for 3 years, correct. I think. And while it is true that I think people in countries that are in the direct crosshairs of U.S. imperialism understand more about imperialism than we do in this country, I think we overestimate the depths of people's knowledge about the difference between, U.S. imperialism that's at the point of the U.S. war machine with, U.S. invading and fomenting coups and that kind of thing, and the difference between U.S. soft power. Now, I don't know how much Bobi Wine knows, but I will say, and I will certainly concede that maybe there's something else going. Maybe this is a part of a strategy that, he is laying out that he's not telling anybody about, and something else will come out in the next few weeks, and we'll all go, oh, well, okay, that's, but from what it looks like to me right now, it looks to me as if Bobi Wine is the target of U.S. soft power that's actually not so soft, right, where you've got Museveni on one side directly threatening his life in Uganda, and you've got the United States State Department on the other side probably making the same kinds of threats.
Well, I mean, but also remember what Brother Allimadi said. Museveni's time is coming to an end.
Sure.
And the United States, playing on, okay, who can we use next? So we know that Museveni is getting ready to go. So we don't want to throw our bets behind this horse because he eventually has to go. So we'll court wine, because in the end, it's still about our interest.
Right.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Bobi Wine might be in that position where the United States is saying, okay, fine, we are letting go of Museveni because he bit the hand that fed him. And he's, we've gotten our mileage out of him. So let's see how far we can go with this wine person.
Yes,
that is happening.
Yeah, I imagine.
But
you can't discount a scenario like that, right?
Yes.
So then the ultimate test is going to be how you now on the driver's seat negotiate that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then once you get into that seat, there are sharks in the water.
But that's the problem, because we understand that how the United States go, making a deal with that devil, no matter on what level you lose.
There's sharks on the water, and you now have to navigate that water.
Right.
And I imagine a person like Patrice Lumumba.
Yeah.
You led the Congo to independence. Now there's sharks in the water, and there are sharks in the water. You have to negotiate. You have to be around to implement any of the agenda that you have for the country. I imagine he weighed the pros and the cons of many of the decisions that he took. I mean, obviously, he knew the relationship between Belgium and the United States, Belgium being the immediate colonial power, Belgium being in NATO, having that tight relationship with the United States. He knew that for him to start off by saying, let me embrace alternative base of support to try to stabilize Congo when Congo was getting chaotic.
Right.
Let me try to see if we can get support from the East. He knew that would be a death sentence immediately. He's a very smart person.
Right.
So he comes to the West and he says, listen, I really want to be neutral, not aligned. I want to get support from the United States. I want to see what I can get from the East as well. But I came here first. The Belgians really didn't educate anybody. So the biggest investment that we're going to need is for education.
Right.
And that's why I'm here. And he is spurned and he's ignored. And then he tries to get support from the Soviet Union. And just as he feared, they use that as an excuse to eliminate him. Now, you have to look at the way that Bobi Wine has ascended to the position where he is right now. It's very different when you come from a popular armed resistance, for example, where you seize control and you set your agenda. You are in a position of a Fidel Castro. Even with Fidel, he came to Washington first, and yet they spurned him. But he was in a position. His boat was a little wider. He could navigate and he could make his decisions. And ultimately, he did. The margin was very narrow for a person like Patrice Lumumba. The margin is also relatively narrow for Bobi Wine. The biggest thing, of course, that is working in his support is the support of the youth, the overwhelming numbers, which is very clear to Museveni, which is also very clear to the West. They know that he has the popular support. And that is why they're now talking with Bobi Wine. They're now positioning themselves to work with him post Museveni. When he was under house arrest, the United States ambassador tried to visit him, and she was blocked at the gate by soldiers. But even that itself was a very powerful statement. That means they're really sending clear message to Museveni,
right,
that you are now the past.
Right.
Otherwise, why would they even dare visit Bobi Wine when they could see that Museveni sees him as public enemy number one?
right. That's
So
right.
now you're coming to meet with public enemy number one. It means you see Museveni as public enemy number one. I mean, is he in a position like, let me try to find another African example. Maybe like Samora. Yeah, Samora Machel in Mozambique. They fought an armed insurgency, defeated the Portuguese, kicked them out. And they were in a position in a stronger bargaining power. Not only did they have the popular support, they had the armed popular support. Now in Uganda, Bobi Wine is popular, yes, but Museveni still holds the army. Right. It's not like he raised his own army and marched into power. So I say all this to just show the limits of his space for maneuvering as well, even though it's quite clear to everybody right now that he is the next leader in Uganda.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make it clear that, Milton, this was not the first time that we brought up the issue of Bobi Wine's questions around who is involved with Bobi Wine, because when you and I spoke a month ago, there were some rumblings about some U.S. agencies that were interested, like the National Endowment for Democracy, I think, were very interested in Bobi Wine's campaign, and we talked about that a month ago. So for those of you who are watching, you need to go to our YouTube page on Luqman Nation and watch the video, the interview that we did called Uganda is Bleeding a month ago, where we did raise this issue of some questions about U.S. involvement in Bobi Wine's campaign. So this is not an issue.
And these are all legitimate questions. They're all legitimate questions that you raise for us in the progressive communities. If we don't have these discussions, then it would be like we are avoiding the elephant in the room. Right. We have to have these discussions. Yeah, I think the saddest thing in Africa right now is that we really don't have situations where we can nurture these young, radical voices, because the institutions to uplift the consciousness and to provide the education, they don't even exist. Most of the universities no longer offer, the kind of radical economics and politics, the lessons that were much more available in the 60s, in the 70s, when people like Walter Rodney taught in the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, although that was the era when African socialism was still very much on the agenda. You had Julius Nyerere, president in Tanzania, and his generation. But ever since that generation passed on, we've not had that new emerging class in Africa. The closest that is in a prominent position right now, of course, is Julius Malema in South Africa. And obviously he comes from a party that had once embraced a progressive socialist vision in terms of its freedom charter, the African National Congress. And then, of course, Mandela was locked up before the policy could be implemented. The ANC had to go underground. And when Mandela was released, it was the elderly Mandela, that the Freedom Charter was sort of put on the shelf at that time. And the priority was to formally end apartheid. And I personally think it was a wise decision. I didn't think a person who was in his 70s could be expected to continue that struggle to recover the land. I think that should fall on Malema's generation right now. But the key point I'm making is that we do not have enough of the Julius Malemas in African countries right now.
Well, getting that we've coming to the end of time, I want to broaden the discussion because we spoke a lot about Pan-Africanism with respect to the African continent. And as you know, Brother Allimadi, is that there seems to be, I won't say a resurgence, but there seem to be within the diaspora camps of whether Pan-Africanist thought, as opposed to those who of the diaspora, as opposed to limiting the struggle to nationalism. Now, what my question would be is, everything that you have related to us here,
yes,
and those of us in America and throughout the diaspora, why should we of African descent care about what's happening in Uganda and elsewhere, which you just laid out?
And Somalia.
And Somalia,
yeah,
right.
If you can touch on that a little bit.
Well, because in Africa that is in charge of its territory and its resources would empower African people and African descendants all over the world. There would be no need to have impoverished pockets of Black impoverished communities in the United States, in Brazil. There would be no need to have an impoverished country like Haiti. These are artificial impoverishment. Poverty, which is manufactured and controlled by the West, by the former colonial powers, by the current imperial powers of the world. Africa's resources, China today is a superpower because of Africa's resources.
Oh, say that again.
Yep. Wow.
Africa's resources has turned China into a global power. So if Africa's resources could turn Africa itself into a global power, the beneficiaries would not only be Africans on the continent, but it would be Africans globally. A United States of Africa would not allow Haiti to be abused the way it is and taken advantage of by the United States or France. It simply would not, because Africa would be listened to. A United States of Africa would have the resources to invest in African American communities in this country. Why are they investing the resources of Africa in European banks, for example, when they could empower Black owned and controlled banks all over the United States? You know, all this may sound like a fantasy because obviously right now it cannot be delivered, you see? But at one point when we talked about African countries being independent, that sounded like a fantasy. In the 1940s, even in the 1950s. In the 1960s, there was a so-called blue paper by so-called liberal politicians in Belgium. And they said, we think Congo can be independent within 100 years.
Oh, wow.
And that was seen as optimistic. Of course, Congo was independent within a few years, at least formal independence, right? So meaning we have to start thinking of how the real Africa can and should be. And the real Africa would be the Africa that Kwame Nkrumah envisioned. And in his book, he also lists all of Africa's resources in that book. And anybody can get that book for under $30. It packs a lot of information and it offers the blueprint of the Africa that would empower Africans, as I said, on the continent, but globally as well. Materially and psychologically as well. There would be no need for any African descendant to be ashamed of Africa.
Now, Milton, let me interject real quick because, and I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I think this is an important question to ask with what you just said about if Africa is united, then it would be able to support African descendants throughout the world in the diaspora and especially in the United States. Here's the question that a lot of critics of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist thought and ideology would ask. Does Africa want to support Africans throughout the diaspora and in the United States if they had the resources to do it? Because there's this idea that Africans don't care about us.
Yes, of course, because there are many Africans who are uneducated about the African experience in the United States and in the diaspora, and that's by design. It's by the education system. You still have African cities that have statues of the European oppressors and colonizers. So would you blame them? They don't even know themselves. So how are they going to know of Africans in diaspora? But once properly educated, people can change. Look at the level of consciousness in Cuba. It is the same Cuba that used to be ruled by Batista.
That's
The
right.
pre-Castro Cubans are the same Cubans who still occupy that island, but their consciousness has been changed. We can do the same thing in Africa. And Malcolm X also spoke about how the consciousness of Africans in the diaspora, but African Americans, had also been distorted and made to hate Africa. And he spoke about it and there's a short video, audio on YouTube called "You Can't Hate the Roots of a Tree Without Hating the Tree." And he said that was by design. They made us hate Africa while making Africans hate us as well. Well, they were the ones who were exploiting the resources of Africa. So they made everybody hate Africa while they themselves knew the value of what was in Africa. I think we need to have a regular annual conference where we have this open conversation and we dispel all the myths, you know.
That sounds like a job for us.
But right, and you know, Brother Milton, when you said something about the whole mind screwing of, you know, those on the continent, those in the diaspora, you know, everybody knows about the Israeli who made who's a billionaire off of Congolese resources.
Absolutely. Think about that.
Right.
Think about that. Just think about that. Africa has all the resources in the ground. Africa needs capital to exploit that investment. Now, when you go to the World Bank to get that capital, they tell you can't industrialize. You can't provide free education. You can't provide free healthcare. You see? So the World Bank is there to keep Africa at bay. China did not go to the World Bank in order to become an economic power. Right. No, they needed an alternative source of capital. And Africans in diaspora, African Americans, can be that key source of that capital that will transform Africa.
That's a whole nother discussion, right?
But that's going to be episode. We got to bring it back for that. Right. Yeah, we got to bring back on that because that I think, if I may say, this has been expressed by people like Akon, the singer. This has been expressed by a lot of African entertainers and stuff who are pushing the investment into Africa, like Brother Milton said about the alternative sources. Brother Milton, I remember it was about maybe a couple of years ago, and it was a group down in Brazil. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that the Black Brazilians are catching hell a lot.
Yes,
and, a lot. And I remember there was I can't remember the name of the organization, but there was a Black Brazilian organization that did a video some years ago on Facebook, was making the rounds on Facebook, and they made an appeal, especially to African Americans. You know, basically what you were just saying. It's like, you know, we can't afford to think that we could fight this global apparatus of white supremacy alone. It's just not going to happen.
Right. And we need to know that there are like-minded people all over the world that are ready to engage in this necessary war. I know we're running out of time. I just want to say something very quick about Somalia.
Yes.
Somalia is the biggest distorted story in the world. Remember that whole issue with the pirates and piracy?
Yes.
some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, nobody was telling you why these young men were doing what they were doing in the first place. They knew it, but that was not part of the agenda to tell the truth. Everybody was stealing Somalia's rich fish resources, billions of dollars worth of fish, because the Somalian state had collapsed. So they're not in a position to police their coastline, which is 2,000 miles long.
Wow.
The Somali young people had no interest in so-called piracy. They were just going to fish to feed themselves and their families. And then you know what happened? These big ships, massive ships from Asian countries, from Europe, were coming and chasing them away from their own waters while they were stealing all this fish, billions of dollars worth of fish. This story was never told. That was the true story. Instead of demonizing these young men who had been basically trying to feed themselves, and you forced them to start taking those reckless measures by jumping into the ships and trying to extort some money. Why? Because you ruined their profession, which was fishing, number one. Number two, you're stealing all the fish and taking it back to your country. Even as we speak today, the illegal fishing off Somalia's water is still going on. But that never makes the headline. It makes the headline when a couple of hungry teenagers jump on some Western or Asian ship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, just to back up the story that he was saying, just recently they had a story on Al Jazeera where they went to, I believe it was Senegal, and they were talking about a lot of the young people who are trying to make the migration to Europe. Right. And they talked to one young man who said that, he said, we can't make a living here. He said, there's no fish in the ocean.
Right.
Yeah.
And because Western countries have literally stolen. That's just amazing. And since then, Milton, there has been like a shadow war going on that the United States has been at the forefront of in Somalia. Never makes U.S. media. Nobody ever talks about it. Troops that people didn't even know were in Somalia were allegedly pulled out of Somalia, I think in January, U.S. troops.
Right.
But apparently there's still some operations going on. And I think for me, and for many of our viewers who are familiar with the U.S. military apparatus around the world, we are wondering, how do we combat U.S. imperialism in places like Uganda, in Senegal, in Somalia, all around the continent and really around the world, but we're focusing on the continent right now. How do we combat U.S. imperialism in these shadow wars like what's going on in Somalia when AFRICOM is on the continent? And AFRICOM, right. we're talking about hundreds of bases and operations that most people in this country know nothing about, so they don't even know how to fight. That's right.
You just took the answer out of my mouth. Most people don't know about it, so it's really hard to combat it. And it's you provide some of the few platforms where we get a chance to discuss this, where we get a chance to expose this, and then we can mobilize protests against this. That's the only way it can be done, by people actually protesting, organizing demonstrations, and pushing back, exposing the nefarious ongoings. So you mentioned the 700 or so soldiers that were withdrawn. Where were they? Where did they take them? Did they show them landing somewhere here in the United States and coming off? No, of course not. Right. So they could have simply been redeployed to another African country.
Wow.
Maybe to Uganda, or maybe to some of the U.S. ships off the coast of Africa. So the withdrawn can really mean many things. Maybe physically removed from the ground from Somalia, but certainly not left Africa.
Wait, what U.S. ships off the coast of Africa? What are you talking about, Milton?
No, but really, we need to have these conversations. We need to get more platforms interested in having these kind of conversations. Because as you know, the U.S. always wanted to have an AFRICOM situated on the ground in Africa, but no African country was willing to do so. So the U.S. has relations with countries like Uganda, where you can have unofficial presence. Nobody even knows how many U.S. troops are in Uganda.
Right.
We don't know that, you see. So the U.S. could, in effect, in essence, have AFRICOM on the ground without officially saying we have it on the ground. And actually, I think one of the main reasons why that whole Lord's Resistance Army thing in Uganda was made such a big thing was because the U.S. wanted to use that as an excuse, really, to land boots on the ground.
Right.
Oh, that was the Coney 2000 video.
Exactly.
That we talked about last time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right.
I mean, Milton, did you have anything?
No, I mean, the only thing I was going to say is that we see the same pattern being played out and again.
Yeah.
It's like but I do want to. I know we only got a few more minutes, but could you briefly state, Milton, about because I was just in the historical context. When in the beginning you said that had Rwanda had Uganda not invaded,
Right.
Right.
Rwanda. Rwanda.
Correct.
We would have never knew that the genocide would have never happened. Could you briefly state that, because that's interesting to me?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think our viewers who don't know this history, I think we should leave them with that important history.
Okay, so in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there was a uprising revolution in Rwanda and later in Burundi. It was very bloody, massacres. The monarchy, the king was ethnic Tutsi, and the Belgians exacerbated the rivalries between Tutsi and Hutu. The Belgians during colonial rule used the Tutsi ruling class as their go-between. So then you have a popular revolution, and the Hutu majority took over, and many Tutsis were really massacred, and many fled to the neighboring countries, to Tanzania, to Kenya, and to Uganda. And in Uganda, that young generation grew up as refugees. Now, when Museveni fought and he seized power in 1986 in Uganda, he used many of these descendants, the young Tutsi, to fight in his army. And then when he took over power, they became soldiers and officers in his army. That's 1986. And then come 1990, he allowed them to invade Rwanda because they're now fully equipped with Ugandan weapons, Ugandan uniform, because they're members of the Ugandan army.
Right.
So about 4,000 of them were allowed to invade Rwanda. And Museveni had sold this narrative to the United States of displacing the French influence in Rwanda. And apparently the US bought that idea, and they allowed the invasion to go on and the war to keep going on, keep escalating. And then sometimes you light a fire that you cannot control.
Right.
So the US and Museveni lit that fire by invading in October 1990. That story is conveniently left out from the popular narrative. It's like they make it appear as if Africans just woke up one day and said, "Let me grab my knife.
Right.
I'm gonna cut off some Tutsi head. I'm gonna cut off some Hutu head." Because they know that stereotype, that racist stereotype, is a story that is easily accepted.
Exactly.
In the West. So it allowed them to leave out that whole US Ugandan involvement in destabilizing Rwanda. The massacres were occurring during the invading army itself were committing crimes, but they never wrote about it because these were our insurgents, you see? But then the fire just consumed the entire country after the plane carrying the president of Rwanda at that time was shot down.
Right.
And they, notice they keep saying by Hutu extremists. But actually it turns out that the missile was provided to the Rwanda Patriotic Front, which was the invading army from Uganda. And they're the ones that actually shot that plane down. And it can be established if the United Nations would agree to investigate. But the United Nations knows the conclusion already. That's why it's not willing to investigate. So if you look at it, Uganda is directly, through Museveni's invasion, responsible for the genocide that occurred 4 years after the invasion. And the US also bears responsibility by allowing the Ugandan invasion, by equipping the Ugandan army, and by training officers, including Kagame. In fact, there are reports that the US was providing the global satellite intelligence to the invasion army as the war continued. There's one interesting documentary made by the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC. It's called Rwanda's Untold Story. That documentary discusses a lot of the elements that I just narrated. At one point, I used to be one of the few people that wrote about this particular issue, you know? They made the documentary where Kagame's own former ambassador to the United States and the former commander of his army say that, yes, it was Kagame who ordered that plane to be shot down. Right. That documentary has not been broadcast in the United States, not by accident.
Right.
That is definitely a documentary that we have to get our hands on and watch and share it with our viewers. Listen, I mean, this is why we're going to do this regularly once a month. And since it's on the 5th, we'll make this, Milton, if you will agree, the first Friday of every month.
Absolutely.
It's your time.
Is your time.
Yeah, it's your time.
Imperialism night.
Absolutely. I always feel reinvigorated and empowered whenever I engage in Pan-African conversations. So I can't wait till the next one. How's that?
That is absolutely what we want. Listen, folks, we will continue to watch the goings on in Uganda. We'll continue to watch what's going on in Somalia. And we thank you so much, Milton, for coming, breaking down these issues, answering the difficult questions, really just being willing to engage in principled struggle about these issues that are so critically important to us here in the United Snakes of America.
And I also like to give a shout out to the chat, which was so civil today.
I mean, y'all were fabulous. Information. Y'all were exchanging book information. Is wonderful.
Yeah.
We love to see that. We appreciate y'all. We ain't had to put nobody in timeout. God bless y'all. That's wonderful. You make me feel good about myself, and I don't feel like somebody's angry mother. So, Milton, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. Take care. Talk to you next time.
Okay, stay strong.
All right, you too.
Next up, we have
at 7 p.m.
At 7 p.m. Yep.
Don't go nowhere, y'all, because it's the premiere of episode 5 of The Last Dope Intellectual. And woo, it's going to be a good one. We're going to go get our snacks and get comfortable and deal with this dog right here who kept wanting to say hello. And we will see y'all at 7 p.m. And we will see you here in Luqman Nation later on. Stay tuned for some episodes next week about why the Luqmans are Pan-Africanists and some other stuff. Y'all take good care of yourselves. Peace, if you're willing to fight for it.
How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. Had them on long before it down low. How they came and they on top and I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up through some bucks down. Todd told the valet pull the truck round. Push the line up that we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter money.